David, I want to start with you.
I'm David Morgan. I am the co-founder of an organization called the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association, focusing on moving the needle on media diversity. And I want to make a plug announcement. During the Congressional Black Caucus Conference, we will be hosting a reception for Representative Denman, who some of you might know, who introduced a really, I think, very helpful resolution reaffirming Congress's commitment to diversity, and we hope that will actually generate a strong conversation about diversity. We're looking forward to as much support for her and for that effort, so I'll be following up with Richard to figure out how we can get this group on the case. I'm happy to be here as always.
Very good. Okay.
I'm happy to be here, Gloria Minot, formerly of WPFW.
Everybody here?
No.
Stand
Formerly my name is Labor. I'm Gloria Minot, formerly of WPFW Radio. Hi guys.
Hi, my name is Tamika Smith. I'm a host and a reporter at WAMU.
I'm Alicia Shepard. I'm working on a project for PEN America, and I'm a contributing writer for USA Today's Opinion.
I'm Kamal Luhai. I'm the managing editor of the Afro-American newspaper.
Go straight down.
Hi, I'm Lena Williams, the Washingtonian, retired New York Times reporter. And I also write now a blog for News Skills about Right to Report, First Amendment issues affecting journalists. Hi, I'm Diane Camper. I've been a journalist for the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, and Newsweek. And I'm currently a communications officer for the Public Welfare Foundation, but in 8 days, I'm going to retire.
Oh, wow.
I'm Miranda Spivak. I'm freelancing for Reveal for the Center for Investigative Reporting, and in the spring I'm going to Macedonia on Fulbright, where I'm going to teach journalism. So I'm interested in all kinds of free press issues because that's a choice that's really not there.
Here too.
We have free press issues here.
Paul Delaney, spent most of my career in the New York Times. You don't hear about all the things I've been, I'm sure.
But you can't tell us why, what's the significance of us meeting Mr. Henry's?
Well, I worked at the Washington Star, which was about 6 blocks from here, and this was our watering hole. We either walk, stroll, or stagger up here after work. And eventually, Mr. Henry was the owner, and eventually he started some entertainment. And among the first and possibly the first entertainer was Roberta Flack, who played in this room, and that was her first album. The picture was taken, and we saw the album.
Oh, there it is.
A lot of
above those lights. To see the
Other Bright Star.
Oh, there's Roberta Flack.
First take. Donny Hathaway, when he was at Howard, that started here. So this is really a historic venture.
And now that's
Southeast.
on the wall. There's the album cover of Roberta Flack's first take album, which was recorded right here. You see the wall.
Right on that little stage right here.
Right. Okay, next. What?
Hi all, Betty Ann Williams, formerly with AP, USA Today, and assorted other places, and I'm a freelance editor.
And Betty Ann and Paul are on the organizing committee of this, along with myself, of this event.
Hi, I'm April Simpson. I'm associate editor of Current, and happy to be here.
Hello, Kenny Burns, news anchor and soon-to-be reporter at WHYY in Philadelphia.
All right.
and was also the Washington correspondent for Latino USA. So a little bit of radio, a little bit of print.
Very good, okay.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Trying to get you for a long time. So.
And I should note one of our inaugural honorees at the multiple.
Oh, very good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Ivan From. I'm former executive director of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. I now do freelance journalism and do some communications on immigration issues.
Okay, well.
I'm Flo Purnell. I am a managing editor at a think tank called Institute for Defense Analysis. You know, we say at a think tank. But I used to work at USA Today, Emerge Magazine, National Public Radio, and
Okay. All right, Peter.
My name is A.P. Bailey. I'm a former associate editor of Ebony, and I'm currently on the executive committee of the Pan-African Federalist Movement. We're having a big conference in Ghana in December. Where black people come from all over the world to attend this conference, and we were celebrating the 60th anniversary of the first All-African People's Conference called by President Nkrumah. And I'm also a columnist with Tri-City where I serve.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle Gurley. I'm the deputy editor of the American Prospect magazine.
Okay, Barbara. Start with you.
I'm Barbara Reynolds, and Saturday I'll be 76,
Whoa.
and I have 5 years. No, wait a minute.
No.
But I have 55 years in journalism.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
I started at the Columbus Calling Post. I was an editor at Ebony Magazine. I was a Washington correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. I was a founding editor of USA Today. I've written 7 books. The current one is The Memoirs of Coretta Scott King. So God is good.
Yes. Okay. Doreen, Pearl.
Hi, good evening. I'm Doreen Bethea. I'm a multi-platform editor at the Washington Post. I am Jackie Jones. I work a bunch of places, but currently I am the assistant dean for programs at Morgan State University. And I am looking for a professor to teach our graduate programs.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Pearl Stewart. And I'm a retired journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle, Oakland Tribune, and I also taught at Florida A&M, Howard, Xavier, a couple other places.
Ain't you?
You know.
Hi, I'm Vernon Smith. I work at the National Ocean Service. Formerly worked at the Dallas Morning News.
Juliet. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Juliette Beverly. I am a content manager at brainfacts.org. It's published by the Society for Neuroscience.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori Grant. I'm the managing editor at Transport Topics. Glad to be here.
Yes.
I'm Adam Powell. I'm a recovering journalist from CBS News, NPR, etc. And now I'm Washington programs for University of Southern California and Drury Center. And we do I'm also president of the Public Diplomacy Council of the U.S. We do a monthly free lunch. Paul comes every month. On the intersection of technology, diplomacy, and information. So if anybody wants to join our list,
Yeah, when's the next one?
September 10th.
I'm Carol Porter, former graphic designer at the Washington Post, and did layout and design, and I'm an artist, fine artist too.
And she designed our Journal-isms Roundtable logo. All right.
Oh, okay.
I'm Ron Taylor, veteran journalist and native of Washington, and native of this neighborhood, as a matter of fact, because my library was right up there. Exactly. This is the place.
Okay.
And
Yes.
today.
And today, today's my birthday.
Oh, all right.
Well, which version of Happy Birthday should we sing?
To you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
I'm Lynn Adrian. I'm the director of the graduate reporting seminar in broadcast and digital journalism for the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. I'm also on the advisory board for both Press Forward and the PowerShift project at the museum, which deals with harassment, sexual harassment, other harassment, and workplace instability, and formerly ABC, NBC, CBS. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pat Giller, and I am retired professor from Morgan State University, and I am just enjoying the hell out of retirement.
Okay.
That's the real answer.
Hello, I'm Jessica Lee. I'm a recovering journalist. I've worked in South America and Texas and here, and I'm from here too. So, I worked for USA Today for a long time.
All right.
Hello, everybody. My name is Darren Snyder, and I still playing journalism, even though it's my side gig. I write a sports column twice a week in the Washington Times. Pay no attention to anything but the sports. I was a full-time journalist for about 25 years with Gannett. 4 publications in Gannett: USA Today Baseball Weekly, Fort Myers, and Binghamton. So I still have a foot in the industry, but my full-time job, I'm now a community relations manager for a 25-year-old nonprofit in Prince George's County. We help people who need some help. And I recently was an editor of a book summary of Dr. Harry Edwards' book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, written in 1968. 1968 was the year that John Carlos and Tommy Smith stood on the Olympic podium in Mexico City and did the salute. And Dr. Harry Edwards wrote about that in 68, and I wrote a summary of it. It's only $2.99. It's an ebook. It's a summary, a quick read, $2.99. Help a brother out.
Here. What about that?
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm Janice Simple. I'm the curator for Own Voices, and that's the live stream channel that you guys are going to be on this evening. And we share Black history, culture, innovation, technology, 365 days a year. And I'm also a social media micro-influencer. Okay. All right.
Karen?
Sure. Oh, and Mike Otley's on here.
Oh, good.
He says hello.
Good. Hey, Mike. Mike was a guest sitting at this very table a couple of summers ago. He
National Foreign Assignment Editor.
He left Miami Herald, and he would go to Eastern Europe and China and all these various places and work there for a while and maintained a blog, which is still online, called Mike Tends to Travel. And he eventually landed in one place at the LA Times, which is where he is now on international and national.
Foreign, yeah, the foreign. Foreign assignment.
So, hi, Mike. Okay, Sharon.
Southeast, still pumping, still having a good time.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm Richard First, and I write a column called Journal-isms about diversity issues in the news business. And if anybody's wondering why I'm wearing this shirt, I will take off this jacket and show you that I was at the Eddie Day convention at the Virgin Islands. These shirts encouraging people to visit and have a good time, and I concur with that. So. Hopefully, they were giving out raffles also, with free books and bottles of rum and all that good stuff. And hopefully next year I can get that too. All right, now for our head table, and we can start at the end of it.
So thank you for having me. My name is Maria Peña, and I've been a journalist for close to 30 years for different outlets. I started off in broadcast, ended up in print, and for the last 3 decades I've worked for different international news media, including UPI, back when UPI was a big thing. Also Univision, Telemundo, EFE, which is an international newswire from Spain, and now with La Opinión in Print Media. So we cover mainly the Hispanic community, so I do cover diversity issues and all issues that affect minorities and Latinos in particular. So immigration right now, for instance, is getting a lot of play. So I am the only correspondent for my outlet in DC, which means I have to hustle and run to the White House, run to the Hill, and the State Department, and DHS, and all the other federal agencies. So I'm here in DC.
Yeah. Okay. And we met again at the.
And we met at the conference in Miami for the
National
Association of Hispanic Journalists.
Right. She was on a panel about Latinos who cover the White House.
Oh, wow.
Hi, everybody. Dan Shelley. I'm the Executive Director of the Radio Television Digital News Association. We used to be the Radio Television News Directors Association, but that changed in 2009. We're headquartered here in D.C. in the National Press Building, but I live in New York, and when I'm not traveling around the country, I split my time between D.C. and New York. RTDNA is the world's largest professional association devoted exclusively to advocating on behalf of broadcast and digital journalists. We have also, for nearly 40 years, conducted annual diversity surveys in local broadcast newsrooms around the country. And we also have, which is apropos of the times in which we find ourselves, we have a task force called the Voice of the First Amendment Task Force, which has two functions. Number one is to fight any and every perceived or real threat against press freedom. And the second is to help the public better understand why what I call outstanding responsible journalism is essential to their daily lives.
My name is Courtney Raj. Thank you again. This is my second time here. I'm really excited to be here again. I'm the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-governmental.
Can everybody hear, by the way? No?
Okay. Oh, I thought it was good at projecting, but I'm happy to use a microphone. So, yes, I work with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and is it on? No. Okay, I'm just going to try to project really loud. Okay. Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
He's coming.
Can you hear me now?
He's going to help you.
So CPJ started recently a new North America program where we are tracking incidents in the United States. We never really had to do that on a systematic basis. We are one of 30 organizations working on the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. We're one of the managing partners on that. Very interested to hear from all of you. I was scribbling all your names. Did not get them all. Would love, please grab my card, give me yours. We want to hear from journalists about the dangers that they're facing, the threats. We want to know, are you affected by the fake news rhetoric? Have you had the enemies of the people thing thrown in your face? We want to hear from you. I am a journalist by background as well. I worked at the New York Times. I worked in Lebanon. I did my PhD in Egypt and freelance while I was there. And then I worked in Dubai, where I got kicked out of the country for an article I wrote. So press freedom is very near and dear to my heart. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much.
All right.
Is this working? Everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I am Kenneth Jost. That's J-O-S-T. Colin Jost, the funny guy on Saturday Night Live, is not my cousin. In any event, if you count junior high school paper and senior high school paper, I've been in journalism for 56 years. After that, at Harvard College, I was news director of WHRB, Harvard Radio Broadcasting for the Greater Boston area from studios in Cambridge. And then I went to the Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm very proud to say that I am an alumnus of the Tennessee in John Siegenthaler's era. He was a great editor to actually cut my journalistic teeth off. Now I am the author of the Supreme Court Yearbook, the annual reference book on the Supreme Court published by CQ Press. My blog is Jost on Justice. That's also my Twitter handle and my Gmail address, Jost on Justice. I'm here representing the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm on the local chapter board, and SPJ, of course, is a professional journalism society devoted to all of these important transparency, accountability, access issues, etc. And as a correspondent at the Supreme Court, I'm looking forward to the day when cameras and microphones are finally allowed in. But that may be when my grandchildren are coming in. And I should also just note that I'm a member of one other professional journalism society in LGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists.
Hi, I'm Kyle Pope. I don't know if you can hear me through this.
Yeah, it was just working.
I'm the editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, which hopefully all of you know. CJR has been around since 1961 as a watchdog of journalism and a champion for journalism. I'm very happy to be here. I've heard about this group for a while, and your reputation precedes you. Thrilled to be here. I have two claims to fame, really. One is I was the first editor hired and then fired by Jared Kushner at the New York Observer.
Oh, wow.
We can talk about that all night. And my real claim to fame is I publish Paul Delaney's work in CJR. He seems to get all of us in a bit of trouble. So, thank you.
Okay. Well, since you've got the floor, let's talk about the next issue. We also have, for those who are interested, we have some, Kyle will kind of bring some extra copies of the print edition of CJR, for those who are interested in it right up here. And I'm asking him to tell us about the next issue he's working on. I think I mentioned in the note that it's about race.
So for those of you who haven't read CJR in a while, the print issue is organized around a single topic. So we take a single topic and we dive deep and sort of explore what it means for journalism. We've done, this latest issue is about jobs. The previous one was about threats to the press, which we actually did in conjunction with the Committee to Protect Journalists. An issue before that was about Trump. And so the next, just to back up, there's been a lot there's been a lot about journalism that has fundamentally changed over the last year under Trump. But I think one of the things that's really come to the fore is the problem that has been caused by the lack of diversity in newsrooms in this country, where there just has not been very much movement at all. And we've seen what that means in terms of coverage, and we see what it means in terms of the pipeline for journalists coming up. So we're devoting the entirety of the next issue to looking at race in journalism. The magazine is going to be, my partner in the project is Jelani Cobb, who's going to be the guest editor with me, who's a colleague of mine at Columbia, and a terrific, amazing writer for the New Yorker and a lot of other places. The core of the magazine is going to be looking at 10 markets around the country where the gap between the diversity of the news outlets and the demographics of the community is particularly large. So again, we're looking at places where the community has changed dramatically in terms of who lives there, but the makeup of the newsroom has not. And what we're trying to figure out is, and this is a source of frustration for all of us, sort of like, why does this needle not move? So we're really going to focus in on these newsrooms, try to figure out what has happened here that has prevented them from staffing appropriately. And then sort of, so there's one question about why is the newsroom not kept up. But the second question is, how is this affecting coverage? Whose picture is being put on the front page? What sources are people writing? So we're sending writers into these 10 communities and are going to be doing these pieces on these 10 newsrooms. To your next question, I'm hesitant to tell you the names of the newsrooms right now because that may change. Some may drop out, others may come in, and I don't want to put people on this list right now. But we've got an amazing group of writers and photographers and thinkers looking at this question. And so I'm really interested in any thoughts you have about. Again, we have this sort of luxurious situation that we have 120 pages of a magazine to delve into the subject of race in journalism. And so I would love any ideas you have about how you would tackle that. Yeah.
Did any of the papers ever have an appropriate match between diversity in their newsroom and the diversity in their community? Because that's been a problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard. I don't have all of them in my head, but my quick answer is no, none of them.
That's when I start
But the issue is that in a lot of these communities demographically are a very different place. They've changed a lot in terms of the makeup of the communities that they're writing about, and these papers have just not kept up. And there's a ton of excuses. People talk about, well, the staffing has fallen dramatically, or we're not getting kids through J school, but this pipeline issue is sort of it's a big sort of grab bag for a lot of excuses for why none of this is happening. But yeah, I mean, it's never been good, but it shouldn't be getting worse, which is what seems to be happening.
Yeah. Just in the interest of transparency, can you give us a breakdown of CJR's diversity numbers?
Sure.
As a J96.
Yeah. So I can only do that by telling you that it's a very small staff. We have one full-time writer who is an African American woman whose name is Alice Neeson, who comes from the Village Voice. We have myself. We have a managing editor, and we have a digital editor. All three of us are white. We have a social media editor who's a black man, and we have a business manager who's a Hispanic woman. That's who we are.
Okay.
And it could be much better, but we also have a network of correspondents around the country who are freelancers, and I don't have the numbers on that because people come in and out, and we don't have them under a contract. We also have fellows who are 3 full-time postgraduate jobs, and those people change over every year, and we're in the middle of changing the class. But it's a totally different question.
You made a comment about you made a comment about it getting worse, and I was curious how you were tackling the macroeconomic forces affecting industry when you look at the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key. That's a key factor to look at in terms of salaries are going down, and if you come from a family that can't afford to support you while you get on your feet in journalism, it's hard, and it's particularly hard for people of color. Journalism schools, including the one I work in, are incredibly expensive. Not all journalism schools are incredibly expensive, but a lot of them are. Free internships are still a problem, which is the problem that folks of color get disproportionately hard on. So yeah, I mean it's all the stars are all in misalignment, and I don't think you can address any of this without thinking about the economic issues. So that's one of the stories that we're working on.
The diversity surveys tend to do numbers, but they don't address promotions. They don't address, what positions people have, and so if you want a suggestion to go into in one newsroom to look at that, like retention as well as just developing staff.
Well, this is a sort of
not enough to hire.
This is a sort of like a thing that I get annoyed about is I think the numbers are bad. I mean, if you look at the diversity, most people use the ASNE numbers, and even those numbers are bad. But those numbers aren't accurate. I'm sorry to say. They are not. They're not. I know newsrooms, for instance, that cheat. They put their IT staff in the newsroom diversity bucket because their IT staff has a little bit more diversity in the newsroom. So actually, and I think that the RTs in DA, they do their own survey that's outside of the ASNE survey. So their numbers, I can't speak for them.
They're good. They're good.
They have only the best numbers. One of the things that we're going to do at CJR is try to come up with a census that's more accurate. Because you can't, that underpins all this conversation. And if we don't believe that the numbers really reflect what's going on, it's hard. But it's basically has to be a reporting project because if you're asking people to self-report, that's where you get into problems where you get people putting stuff in the wrong bucket. So this is something that we're going to be embarking on over the next year or so.
Lisa brought up a good point about retention because people may reach certain positions within newsrooms. My perspective is broadcast newsrooms and being a senior producer, but it's lonely. It's really lonely, and you can burn out in trying to be that stand for diversity, either gender, race, otherwise, and once you get to that position, they say, we have one, but people will leave because it just gets to be too much.
Well, before you go, I think that we've heard so much about this, and we have a piece that's called The Second Job, which is basically people who like, there's two issues with it. One is, if you're the only black person in the newsroom, every story that somebody feels that some black person needs to look at, which is there should be more people. That's their job. I mean, that's all that they do that, and they get tired of it. This is what people tell us. And then the other thing is just having to be the person who's always pointing out. It's like we should do more. We should have more. We should, and it shouldn't fall. It shouldn't fall on somebody that should not be part of their job description. I don't know if that's what you were.
No, absolutely. And separately, as from a broadcast perspective, when I was at ABC, we actually did a survey about what visual images we were putting on the air, separate from what our reporting was in terms of representing certain things and the unspoken biases we were putting up, like if we did an unemployment line, because most of our bureaus were based in big cities, the unemployment line was always people of color. Or if we were doing a story about cable television and we just had somebody's hand on the remote, a lot of times the hand was not brown.
Right.
And just the fact that you have to approach these things with some sense of intention and awareness, as opposed to just doing your job and thinking that it's that you by default will make sure that everything is equally represented, and it's not. Right. And that's another layer of your job.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, let me just take 1 sentence. I'm not here as a representative of the Supreme Court Press Corps, but unless I'm overlooking somebody, no black folk, no Hispanic folk among the 30 of us who are there on a regular basis. Jesse Holland, a black reporter, now author, was there for the Associated Press, but he got a book deal and so I go to work in a newsroom that's all white.
You know, I wanted to for someone else to address this because it's a question that Is this on? Okay. So it's a question that I get asked a lot because up until recently I was also VP of print for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. When it comes to diversity, when you see the TV talk shows, for instance, on issues that affect Hispanics, except for a handful of people, you don't see minorities being represented either as sources to go to or be quoted on or be put on a broadcast show. So I was wondering if you have looked at that in a serious way, because I know, anecdotally, I know we're not at the table. You know, when CNN is looking at an immigration story, they have the one go-to person, Ana Navarro, she's great, but she's not the only Latino reporter out there. And as a matter of fact, she's not a reporter. She used to be a political consultant, and now she's doing a lot of this other work. But you don't see any Latino reporters at all who are on the battlefield, on the trenches, covering our community. And that bothers me because, we're not out there just covering immigration. I mean, immigration is a big chunk of what we do because it's obvious, it's what's going on now, but it's not the only issue we cover, and it's definitely not the only issue that any of us can comment on. We can talk about the trade wars, we can talk about, jobs and whether or not the numbers being put out by the White House are accurate in terms of Hispanic unemployment and so on. So I was wondering if any of you guys have had an experience in doing a serious study about why is it that mainstream media continues to ignore minority reporters and minority experts who can comment on those issues.
I guess I agree with you, but I would take slight issue with that. In this regard, Kyle mentioned our research. I just haven't read it with me. And this, I will get to directly answering your question, but for 2017, the percentage of women and people of color in TV newsrooms and in TV management were at the highest levels ever measured in 28 years. But while the minority population in the United States has risen 12.4% in the last 28 years, the minority workforce in TV news is up only 7%.
To what level?
To 38.3%.
Can you disaggregate the women from the people of color in that?
People of color specifically, 38.3%. That's people of color in the U.S. Let me be specific. In the TV workforce, it's 24.8%. And TV news directors, the people who are making many of these coverage decisions that you spoke of, 17.4% of TV newsrooms across the country reported having a news director of color, a person of color. And I will tell you the news is bad, however, for radio, which is at near record lows for minority representation in newsrooms. And there has to be a tremendous, now part of that is due to contraction in the radio news business, but that's still no excuse from our perspective. And we're working hard to explain to folks in the industry that it's in their interest to best serve their communities, that they need greater representation in their newsrooms, and especially in their management rank of people of color representative of their communities, to Kyle's point.
Oh, let me ask one question. We need to specify that we're talking about local news.
This is local news, correct.
Why aren't the networks participating in this survey?
Historically, we've not asked them. And the belief has been, right or wrong, and this predates my time as executive director of RTDNA, that if anybody's going to get it right, it's going to be the networks. If anyone's more likely to get it right, it's going to be the networks. Now, yeah, exactly. and I would say, because the pay is better, the conditions sometimes are better, though not always. I served as I spent some time working at CBS, and the networks, in my experience, anecdotally at least, seem to generally do a better job in representing people of color among their workforce than do local stations. But as I just mentioned, our latest research of local newsrooms shows near all-time highs, though still not commensurate with the level of representation of people of color in the overall population.
Oh, okay. Do we want to talk about that one? We want to go on to the White House now. Oh, yeah. All right. One last question on that.
The whole question about how many people are in mainstream newsrooms, we've been fighting about that for 30 years. I remember in '83, I was one of the few. I'm sorry.
Sorry. You can even use one of the mics.
The question about being the only one in the newsroom, that's been going on for so long. But that was my first job back in '83 at Gannett. And it hasn't changed a whole hell of a lot. And your question about, you're focusing on news on print, right?
Print and digital.
Print and digital.
Well, although we are going to get in some to the broadcast too, but the print and digital numbers, bring down all these averages because they're so terrible.
And I'm just thinking about, when we think about race and we think about media, how we're not thinking more broadly about race and media and people. So, for example, you mentioned in your model about where the biggest gaps are. There's entire swaths of Latino communities in this country that get no news at all from anybody. And so that's why I'm wondering why we're not talking more about that. We're talking about a big, broader digital space that is not mainstream media, that's totally independent. We're not dealing with that either. And a lot of people in this country get their news from them. So I'm just wondering if we're still sort of focusing on the old trope of analyzing mainstream media and race as opposed to look at media more generally, considering all the consolidation that's been going on and all the media consolidation and the fact that you have entire communities in the South, for example, where you have huge Latino populations or Somali populations, they get no media at all, none, except through their nonprofit, who then gets maybe 2 hours on radio here or maybe 2 hours of Univision there or something. So I'm just wondering why. I think we're at a point in this country where we need to be thinking a lot more globally and a lot more broadly than the same fight that we've been having now for 60 years.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't want to leave the impression that we were just focused on these bigger markets. We've taken a look at news deserts around the country, and even within, there's also, not to mix a bunch of metaphors, but there's also news donuts, where in larger population centers where you have the center of the city is hollowed out in terms of news, and the suburban, which tend to be whiter populations, get more information. We had an issue. This issue, the race issue that we're working on now, we were doing a big piece on what's happened to the black press, which has been disproportionately hurt as all the other as local news has had all these problems. The black press has had a disproportionate hit. And then the other issue is that a lot of new media tends to be really disproportionately white. A lot of digital first publications. In fact, we had a piece in one of our last issues about a guy who has a hyper-local digital site in Atlanta and went to one of these, I forgot which of the conferences he went to. It was a digital journalism conference. He was the only person of color there, and all of the money that was going, there's been a lot of money flood into local news initiatives, and everybody sort of appreciated like the fact that local news has been wiped out is a big problem for the country. Very little of that money is going into publications that cover communities of color. So it's something we're writing about.
But that's a long time problem with foundation.
Right.
Does your study look at how these outlets do outreaches to minority communities? And the reason I bring this up was because I remember last time in Baltimore, I told somebody that I was covering the city for this station. He looked at me with a straight face and asked me, when the hell do they care about black people? So are they, your issue, are they looking at, do any of these outlets do outreaches or advertises in communities of color or
I haven't seen all the pieces, so I can't answer it definitively. I mean, we have been looking at a newspaper in Queens, New York, which is, I think, is one of the most diverse populations in the U.S., which was there had been a big change in the demographics of Queens, and the Queens local paper that covered it the staff was predominantly white. So they found, but they realized, there's a whole population here that we have to figure out how to cover. But they thought it was actually, they thought they had so little credibility in that market that instead of expanding their paper, that they started a whole new thing. Because they were like, we're not going to get people to believe that we care about what they're doing, so we're going to start a new title under our same brand. They've not been sold, so it's a different ownership. I mean, on the one hand, I guess it's honest of them to say that they have no credibility, but it sort of speaks to what you're talking about.
And by the way, can I, tangentially, but still obviously related, I take umbrage at the term news desert when it is used to describe a lack of newspapers in a specific geographic area, because it discounts the positive impact on a lot of communities in many of those so-called deserts that broadcast and digital journalists play. And a lot of the positive changes that come about in those communities because of problems that are brought to light by broadcast and digital journalists in those areas, even though the newspaper in that particular geographic region is contracted or gone away altogether.
Well, if I could comment on that real quick. Calm down, everybody. The issue, and I'm a broadcaster myself, and this came up in my last newsroom as well. The only time, particularly the TV stations show up in black neighborhoods is when someone gets shot. So, and then if something positive happens, and I could say with a straight face that actually, when I was on a community event, I was able to get positive coverage for a community event I was on a committee of. But other than that, there's no real relationship between minority communities and some TV stations. Now, to RTDNA's credit, they were part of the awareness and reporting toolkit. I was proud to be a contributor to that.
Thank you.
But to be quite honest, yes, television stations for the most part have done some good stuff. But I'm thinking of cities like Baltimore and Detroit, where someone gets shot, you get the live shots, but other than that, you don't really see those news crews until the next shooting. And they don't really establish the relationship with those in the community, and except for long enough to get that soundbite. We need that soundbite hit.
Well, it's the same thing.
And news deserts do exist.
Yeah, and
No, I agree.
I think it's the same thing with the Latino community too.
Yes.
That it's all about immigration, and like nothing else is around. Even though the vast majority of Latinos in the U.S. will come here, and that, for instance, Washington D.C. has the highest percentage of Latino professionals in the country, and you never see any stories about that. And it's all about immigration. And the only time you, like what Maria was saying, the only time you ever see a Latino analyst or a journalist on television is if it's an immigration story. Like, that's the only thing that we're interested in, and that's the only thing that we can talk about. And as a reporter, it's very frustrating, because what if I'm not interested in covering immigration? You know, or what if I'm interested in covering other things? But when you go into a newsroom and you're supposed to be the expert on one subject because you represent that entire community, even though they would never think to ask a white reporter, well, what do white people think about this? You know, but I always get this all the time. Well, what are the Latinos saying about it? Well, I don't know. The last time we all met in Latin you almost have to have like a sense of humor to do some of this stuff, because the questions that you get are, you know, what do you think about this? And then when they say, what do you think? They're not asking my opinion. They're asking my community's opinion. When what I think as a Puerto Rican may be different from what you think as a Nicaraguan, or what you think as an African American. I mean, it's all very different. Or as an Afro-Latino, which is a whole different group of people. And there are definitely huge gaps in the way that a lot of the mainstream media covers things, because there's so much assumption out there, and not enough people of color in management that can actually make the decisions of what it is that we're going to be covering that particular day. And I would be really interested to see the numbers of people of color in management that actually make the decisions of what is done, what is covered that particular day, because I think that those numbers are incredibly, pathetically low.
And sometimes they don't trust your expertise half the time.
Well, that's the other thing too.
Well, yeah, they ask you specifically about your expertise, and they'll ask you, do you think you can be objective about this?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I actually got asked that at a job interview for a newspaper. For an opening of several years ago in Mexico City, well, as a Latina, do you think you'd be able to cover this objectively? And my answer was, well, your Middle Eastern correspondent based in Jerusalem is Jewish. I bet you didn't ask him if he would be objective. But it's okay to ask me if I as a Latina would be able to cover Mexico City objectively.
Yeah, you're a white man.
Do that.
Yeah, you're a white man.
Because the other side to that is that there are so many assumptions that people make about you as a minority journalist, or you being us here. The assumption that you're not going to be objective, and worse yet, at least in my case, that has been. They assume that you are going to be an activist for the community. I'm not going to name this person, but I was interviewing a congressman from Texas, and he literally calls me an activist because I was questioning his votes, actual votes, not opinions, votes on immigration and the border wall. And so he got really upset with me and said, because you journalists, you become activists. And I said, well, how am I being an activist when I'm actually, I'm asking a factual question on how you voted on this particular issue? I don't see that as being an activist. But having said that, it's not a sin to call out politicians and hold them accountable for their votes. So he switched the topic on me because I got upset too, and he noticed it, right? So we were going back and forth in Spanglish and English and Spanish, and I told him, don't do that, don't play that trick on me because it's not going to work. I am not an activist, but I will ask tough questions because your vote is on the record. So you get that a lot. As a minority journalist, they think you can't possibly be objective because you're covering your own community.
Okay, last question on this.
Well, I want to switch
right.
to the Supreme Court. I'm interested in your insights regarding the lack of diversity among the press corps of the Supreme Court. I mean, how would you explain this situation? What accounts for it?
Well, you know, I mean, 30 news organizations, AP, Reuters, the three networks, the New York Times, blah 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 blah. It's happenstance. There's no collective entity to try to make sure that the Supreme Court press corps looks like all of the United States. But Jesse Holland was a good. He was the second string for the AP. The AP has two people there. He got a book contract. He wrote a great book on the slaves who built the White House. I'm sorry he's gone, and I'm sorry that as I said, I'm sorry that the press room that I spend more time in than anyone else is as flavorful as it is.
Is this something that's ever discussed among the correspondents, or in particular?
I've never heard anybody discuss it. I realize now that a Latino was in the Supreme Court press corps until a year ago or so when he changed jobs in New York. So he's no longer part of the Supreme Court press corps. Bob Barnes for the Washington Post has no role in hiring for the Washington Post, and he certainly wouldn't be interested in saying, well, the Washington Post should have a black reporter, so I'll go do something else. One thing limiting it is that there's very little turnover in the Supreme Court press corps. I mean, everybody knows Nina Totenberg, right? Because she's been doing that 45 years.
Institutional memory is valued on that beat to a great extent, which is one of the reasons I think that there's so little turnover. This is not an excuse at all, but it's a premier beat. People work years to get it, as I recall, having worked at AP and USA Today. And once they're there, they have arrived at the destination where they want to stay. It's a special case, which is hard to deal with, harder than some other things. Let's talk about White House reporting.
And there is not just the background, but the expertise. I mean, law is not rocket science, but it's a specialized subject matter.
Steve Henderson used to football. I think it was first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Yes.
Gotcha, yeah.
Yes. I've forgotten him.
Yeah. But he was not replaced by African Americans.
What's the male and female breakdown?
Male female breakdown, if you want to.
More men than women, but Nina Totenberg, Joan Biskubic, Ariana DeVoe for CNN, Jan Crawford for CBS, Marsha Foyle for National Law Journal. So they're women, not 50-50. They're more men than women.
Okay. Let's talk about the enemy.
And for what it's worth, less than 10% gay.
Okay, how did you know? Who's their survey?
All right, let's talk about the enemies of the people who are well represented in this room. On Thursday, after we decided to do this topic, the Boston Globe editorial page decided they were going to encourage all newspapers to write on a single day an editorial about the need for the press to be respected by the White House. And so that's now got more than 100 people to sign on to this. It's going to happen on Thursday. 200 now, okay.
It's going to happen on Thursday.
And now RTDNA has encouraged broadcast outlets to join in as well. So let's I might as well start with you, Dad, about your thoughts on all this. And is this all we should be doing to counter this blitz from the White House?
Well, what we're asking our members and other constituencies within the broadcast and digital journalism space to do is not just a full-throated defense against the president and against the fake news label and the enemy of the American people and the disgusting fake news and the sick fake news and the people who start wars and pick the tweet du jour from the president's Twitter account. What we're asking our members and others in the industry to do is to use Thursday either through an editorial or as part of a newscast or on social media or all of the above, other digital outlets, to talk about what they do to serve their communities and to talk about with transparency the process they go through to resolve difficult dichotomies when ethical issues arise. And we believe through that greater transparency into how the sausage is made, pardon the trite phrase, that people will realize that or we hope at least begin to realize, the people with the red baseball caps at certain political rallies will begin to realize, well, okay, maybe there is more to journalism than just one particular cable channel that they tend to like or one website that they tend to follow that does nothing more than reinforce their pre-existing worldview. So for us, it's not just about defending against attacks from the president and his supporters, which have filtered down to the local level all over America, by the way. But to use the occasion to demonstrate why what we do as journalists serves the community. And to use another trite example, everybody says they hate Congress, but most people tend to like their own member of Congress. Everybody says they hate the media, but according to a Pew survey that came out late last year, most people tend to trust their local news outlet, their local broadcast news outlet in particular. You know, I hate NBC or CBS or NBC, but I sure like that Bill Smith who gives me the 6 o'clock news on Channel 3. So that's an advantage we think we have representing local broadcast journalists and digital journalists to help the Boston Globe amplify its message coming up on Thursday.
Okay. So let me just add very briefly. I called my former newspaper, the Nashville Tennessean, by way of research for this, and yes, David Plazas is the opinion and engagement editor at the Tennessean, and he said, much like what you just said, in the community, you know, we shop at the same grocery store, we go to the same theaters, we go to the same schools, same churches, etc. We don't get enemy of the people much. On the other hand, he did recently just get an email accusing him of fake news. You know, I mean, and so fake news. I guess we need to understand that fake news is just you know the other side's version of brand X, right? And we're not going to win a branding dispute by saying we're not brand X, we're not fake news. What we have to do is, just as you suggested, show what journalists in fact do by way of transparency, accountability, and by way of addressing some of the issues of any number of communities that don't feel well represented in the overall in the overall world of news media. And I have one other pet peeve, which is we shouldn't use news media as a singular noun because it's plural, right?
I gave up on that.
All right. If I can just jump in. So one of the things that we've done at the Committee to Protect Journalists to try to support this initiative through the foundation of what journalism is, which is facts. And as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which started documenting attacks on the press, physical assaults, equipment seizures, subpoenas, etc. There's, I think, like 11 categories. Don't quote me on that, but several categories. We have this data now based on a year and a half of data collection. There are 30 partner organizations. Anyone can submit an incident. I hope that one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is capturing the incidents. But we have that information. We also have the data to put it into perspective globally. Did you know that the United States is now the third most deadly country in the world for journalists after Afghanistan and Syria? That is insane. Mexico was up there, and the U.S. surprisingly. Now, at least we know that there are investigations into those murders, unlike in Mexico where impunity is rampant. But there was a journalist who was killed in Chicago, Zach Stoner. We're still investigating if it was related to his journalism, but there's been very little coverage of that case, in my opinion. I think we need some real good in-depth reporting to see what happened there, find out if that was indeed related to his journalism. I think that by providing the facts, as you're saying, to look into the sausage making, the bread and butter of journalism and of having an opinion in journalism is facts. And so I think these initiatives to track, how many actual incidents are there? And this is why we started in 2017, because we said, we know there's going to be a lot of issues in this administration, because we saw in the lead up to it, this fake news pillorying of the media, lambasting individual journalists and media outlets. And on the fake news issue, the other thing that we've done is document around the world how this fake news issue is actually leading to journalists being jailed. In Egypt in July, there were 11 journalists who were put in jail on fake news charges. We saw between 2016, when we did our census, and 2017, we had 9 journalists in jail in 2 countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, on false news charges. We've seen countries around the world grab onto this idea of criminalizing fake news. Now we had 21 journalists in prison in 2017 on false news charges in 6 countries, and many more countries adopting it. So I think that in addition, this idea that using editorials to show solidarity among the journalism community is really important. We've seen, in Pakistan, for example, the media used to not even report the names of journalists from competing publications who were killed or kidnapped because they didn't want to give them the free publicity. That has shifted significantly, and now they have like a WhatsApp group where they coordinate, and they have gotten reporters back from being kidnapped. No, we're not at that point, but I think the solidarity among the community is, really important. And if I may, I just came from the National Press Club. We have an American journalist, Austin Tice, who's missing in Syria for 6 years. I think another way that we could get the public to think about the news and actually how difficult it is. You all know, you're all, the front lines in your newsrooms, what it takes to actually bring the news to people. And I think that, doing more to cover those issues as news issues versus also just opinions would probably be helpful.
I wanted to make a comment.
I don't know if that's going to reach.
So the comment that I wanted to make, hello? Okay, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. So, okay. So the comment that I wanted to make, not only in terms of fact checking, I mean, we talk a lot about fact checking. What I worry about as a journalist is the broader questions of, promoting a national dialogue in the country to talk about the issues that matter to people, to talk about the issues that affect voters, consumers. And what I worry about when you look at the history of journalism in the States it's not new. Being attacked by the way we cover stories is not new. The very first publication in the U.S. back in the 17th century folded after the first issue because the government didn't like what the paper was saying about the government. So, but I think now obviously we live in a more polarized society. So when you look at AP does it, we try to do it too. A lot of media outlets are doing fact checking. So the president says something, we rush and say, no, that's incorrect or that's inaccurate. The real figure is this or whatever. What I worry about is that we, like you said earlier, people tend to gravitate to coverage and views that reinforce their own views. So how do we get out of that messy situation where no matter how much fact-checking we do, people and his supporters in particular are not being swayed by the fact-checking, are not being swayed by us trying to be as objective as we can possibly be to provide coverage of the issues that matter to them. So how do we get beyond that? Because obviously it's not making a dent in the way we are seeing ourselves in the society.
I actually think that there is a risk with these kind of. I mean, I'm a fan of these editorials, but I do think there's a risk of sounding whiny, or sounding like we're special and we have all these problems and you should feel sympathy for us, which I don't think is going to accomplish the goal of getting people to care. I think, sort of to the point that you made, I think one of I think there has been historically in journalism a arrogance about we're the First Amendment, we do important stuff, trust us. And a big chunk of the country is saying, no, we're not going to trust you. And so I think we have to sort of change the way we think about it. And I think what you said about focusing not so much on why you should care about us as a profession, because most people don't, or even on why you should care if we're getting harassed, which most people won't. But what they will care about is to focus on the effects of what we do. Sort of say, like, do you care about the fact that there's a gymnastic coach in your community that's abusing kids? Mm-hmm. That story was broken by a local paper. Do you care about the fact that there is a chemical plant upstream from where you live that's dumping junk into the river that you're going to be drinking? Do you care about the fact that there's a superintendent of the school district in which you live in that's siphoning money out of the budget that's supposed to go in for your kids? Those are the stories that will wake people up. And those are the stories that will resonate with people, and they'll say, this isn't about envy of the people. This is about, like, I want my kid to have a good education, or I want to drink clean water. I think that is the sort of direction that we need to be pushing this in, and not make it so much about us, because that's going to be a really hard sell.
I think it's also going to be perceived as partisan. It's partisan, where it's us against.
And this is the genius of how Trump has framed this, because basically anytime we push back, we're seen as sort of attacking him and attacking his supporters.
No, I completely agree with what Kyle just said and with what you just said. And to me, I think one of the other issues I think we need to talk about here is the conflation of the opinion media versus honest-to-God journalism. I wrote about this in an op-ed piece in USA Today in late July, in July, shortly after the Helsinki summit, where journalists were attempting to ask very tough questions of President Trump and his staff, and then he went on Fox News and got, snowball, powder puff interviews, for lack of a better term, and by opinion hosts who tend to support his agenda and support his narrative. And I think we as an industry have to do a much better job of delineating real news, if you will, from the opinion journalism. And when cable networks intermingled the two on panels, it's not clearly labeled. It's not easily consumed, or well, it's easily consumed, and that's part of the problem. But it's not easy for the average viewer or news consumer or cable show consumer to determine, okay, which one is the journalist and which one has the facts and which one is just giving me opinion or analysis or choosing facts selectively to support their preconceived notion. We've got to be much better as an industry, in my humble opinion, at being not just transparent, as I said earlier, but being very clear about, okay, this guy is giving an opinion, and this woman is the journalist who has actually, to quote Carl Bernstein, found the best obtainable version of the truth. And I think that's so critical right now, and is a big part of this mess that we're in, and it's also a big part of the solution.
But it doesn't seem like the cable networks want to do that. For example, Fox and CNN, they're the worst offenders because with CNN, they have a breaking news banner all the time, even well after the news. The news has been broke. It's in pieces. It's part of it. And as far as Fox goes, every time I blink, you have a Fox News alert, which is like their breaking news production element. But it's Andre Hannity and Laura Ingraham. And there needs to be, someone needs to say, hey, guys, you can't keep doing this. People need to know what's news and what's opinion.
I agree with your conclusion there. I can personally attest, having been at the Fox News Bureau here in D.C., that there are some honest-to-God journalists there who really take offense when some of the opinion hosts use their reporting to frame an argument or a counter-narrative to the facts. That's just the truth. I've seen it myself. In fact, when I was at the Fox News Bureau, there was a big empty space on the wall. I mean, the paint had faded around it. And I said, what used to be there? And they said, well, that was Roger Ailes' portrait. And one of the guys whispered in my ear, that was the happiest day of my life when we took that down.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because it seems to me that news is in a for-profit framework. And so, we're having a discussion with sort of what we call the decision makers that own the networks to help us understand the business of sort of when we look at diversity. But it seems to me that you're in a for-profit environment. You have to do what's profitable. And is there a mismatch between the opinion side of the business as opposed to the hard news when people want to watch opinion, and that's what makes money? Because MSNBC's ratings are through the roof because of the opinion pieces, and when they try to do hard journalism, no one watches.
I'm not exactly sure that's true, but I do think you have a great point, and that is, journalism is a business. And if that business isn't profitable, then journalism cannot occur, which is why you're seeing news deserts, to Kyle's earlier point, layoffs, constriction in the radio business, in industry in particular. So, yeah, I mean, you have a valid point. But on the other hand, a journalist's job is to go out into the community or go out into the world to seek the again, best obtainable version of the truth and to report it to people, irrespective of those economic pressures that his or her boss may be feeling. So, it's a tough question, but it's a very important one.
What about the use of words? When to take it a step further, when we talk about, well, what he said was inaccurate, why not just say it's a lie? That this is a way for the public to discern between here is what he said, this is what we found out, it's not inaccurate, it's a lie.
Because we've had these discussions before. Some journalists would argue that to call it a flat-out lie would assume that you know the intention of whatever the statement was. I agree with you. I would say a lie is a lie. I don't care that he meant something else, but a lie is a lie. Let me give you an example from today. I went to the White House briefing. Sarah Sanders was up there as usual, defending all the statistics and how great he's been with minorities, because almost the entire briefing was taken over by this Omarosa incident and the book she's selling. And so almost the entire briefing was about how he's been great to minorities, and just look at us. Look at the unemployment numbers for blacks and for Hispanics, and blah, blah, blah. And so then the next question was about how they've had to supposedly sign NDAs. And she was making the case, she was making the statement that most administrations, even before Trump came on, have had to, make their employees sign NDAs, and we collectively said, "No, you're wrong. That's a lie." I don't know if you picked it up on the off the air, but we said, "No, you're wrong."
And that's what I'm talking about. That I think to help the average person, the average viewer or reader out there, is to stop dancing around by using these polite words so that people will think, well, let me say it's inaccurate, because if I say it's a lie, I might not sound objective, but it is actually a lie, especially when it's the press secretary who's not working for the president. They're working for the taxpayer, getting $180,000 a year, paid for by the taxpayers, and that the reporters have to be a little bit more aggressive about, like Jim Acosta walking out of the press briefing last week to finally say, let's stop being a bunch of, highly paid stenographers like some people have accused the White House press corps of being, and actually be a little bit more aggressive and say, you know what, it's not true. Non-disclosure agreements have never been signed by any other administration. They're not even enforceable because you're a public employee. If you explain it like that and say it in a way that's more, telling people, this is what we're telling you, that it's not inaccurate, it's an actual lie.
But what I wanted to, I don't know if this gets conveyed when you're watching it on TV or online. Being there almost every day, I can tell you that people are pushing back. Journalists are asking questions, and what we've done, well, she has never called on me to begin with. But I know that what we have done now is, what I've done, for instance, hey, I know you guys, I know she's not going to call on me, but if she calls on you, could you please ask her this question for me? And so we're helping each other out that way. We also help each other out when she's viciously attacking or singling out a particular person in the room, like she's done with Jim Acosta and Brian. I think his last name is Kemmer.
Karen.
Yeah, her. And so the thing is, but my issue is, we're all doing it. We're all aware of what's going on, of the dynamics in that room. How do we push back any further when we know that she has her talking points, and we know that every single day she's going to push back and repeat and repeat and repeat the same response, no matter how many ways you ask the same question? So I'm throwing it back at you, because I know that from our perspective in that room, we are asking the tough questions. They're just not getting answered.
I do think there's been some movement on this question. I do think that you have more news outlets now calling these things a
because
lie.
people are finally getting fed up.
We've engaged in the same debate about whether his actions are racist. I remember after Charlottesville, there was a big debate about, should we call it racially charged or racially tinged, and CJR actually came out and says, if you think that, you should just say racist.
Yeah.
So I think that we have in our profession, we hold as language in some sanctity, and I think using these euphemisms is not sort of doesn't reflect well on the job that we're supposed to be doing.
Wait. Gloria, Peter, and Lori.
I just have a question. I'm glad that the Sinclair Tribune merger fell through. But some time ago, not so long ago, I noticed that the local Sinclair station, which is ABC in News Channel 8, had news people reading editorials from Sinclair. And I never thought that the day would come when I'd see something like that. Is that a trend?
Are you talking about editorials or the promotional
Editorials from Sinclair.
The promotional announcement.
It was the promotion about local.
I mean, but it was really interesting because they made a great video. Like, you probably heard about it because you saw that video, that mashup that went viral, right? And that, you know, you didn't need to editorial. You didn't really need to explain much beyond just like showing what was happening, which I thought was, you know, very powerful. And I just wonder also, like, I wonder what the power of journalistic norms can have, right? Because I think journalism is a profession that depends a lot on norms. And this, you know, being part of this, you know, professionhood, as it were. And I wonder if we've been thinking enough about that so that it becomes uncomfortable, you know, to not be upholding journalistic norms, like saying, you know, using correct terminology, or, you know, having a division between the editorial and the news, for example.
I think that when we stay in our norms too much, we get played. Because we've really held tightly to our norms. I can't believe he's doing this. And being self-righteous about the fact that we're going to stay in the right place. And we get played. And we get played and played.
No, I'm talking about norms within the profession among each other to make.
No, I know. I think that it's in both ways. We have established certain norms which we were trained and brought up with, and then here comes somebody that's playing outside all those norms, and we're trying to hold fast to those norms, and we get played.
Well, wait a minute. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Peter next. Okay.
I go back far enough that I be very frank with you.
Yeah.
For me, the national press, the chickens have come on the roost. I go back to Malcolm X. I remember Brother Malcolm constantly being accused of advocating violence, and he advocated self-defense. But all the mainstream newspapers, television programs, say he was advocating violence, and they did it over and over and over again. I have very little sympathy for what's going on now. I think it's the case. And today, all of a sudden, white supremacists have become white nationalists. These guys are not white supremacists. They're white nationalists. They're white supremacists. But now the press is calling them white nationalists. You know, they called Obamacare. They grabbed the person who came up with the idea for Obamacare to oppose the Affordable Care Act should get a $1 million bonus. Because all of a sudden, it's much harder for a politician to say, I oppose the Affordable Care Act than say, I oppose Obamacare. But all the press says Obamacare. I mean, they have done this kind of thing over and over and over again.
Collateral
and I have very little sympathy for them. I think that Trump has, and I despise Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has pulled through a lot of the stuff that they've been doing. They've been saying things and doing things and labeling people that they didn't like, you know, especially in the black community. You know, those of us who are considered, quote unquote, black militants, you know, we were lambasted and lied about and defamed in the American national press. And by the way, I refuse to say the mainstream press. The majority press is not mainstream. Who's to say they're mainstream? That's another one of those things that, I reject. We have to be very conscious of words. And so I'm sitting here, I have very little sympathy.
Okay. All right, Gloria.
Lena first.
Oh, Lena first.
What you're sensing in Peter is what me as a journalist, having lived, you know, grown up in Washington, D.C., now back in Washington, D.C. after my retirement, that's what I'm hearing. I grew up at a time when once was young and now old. I grew up during the Vietnam War era. Then came Watergate. We had the Pentagon Papers. The press, I wanted to become a journalist because of what I saw. They were the darlings, the civil rights movement, and how they covered it. I was at the New York Times in the lead up to the Iraq War. And what did we do? We had journalists that said there are weapons of mass destruction. We never saw them, but we relied on those reporters. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and all the trust that we had engendered in our public was then undermined. Then you now come to the 2016 election.
everybody was saying Hillary is going to win. Even Obama said, you all tapped into the whole WikiLeaks and what her emails were saying. You were printing Modesto's risotto recipe. There are people in my community that say, it's your fault. I'm not even a journalist anymore. You guys did this. What were your polls saying? Everybody, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, CBS poll, Wall Street Journal, they were all saying she has it. They feel that they've been snookered. And where we were once the darlings of the press, what you're seeing now in the black community with all these police shootings, they're not coming from journalists. They're coming from ordinary people who pull out their cameras and say, see what's going on? We've been telling you all this for decades. It takes the little girl on the street or a woman sitting in a car. That's what we're seeing. The press never saw that. So when he's tapping into the fake news, he's tapping into something in these communities where people are saying, you guys have not been genuine completely.
That's so interesting, and I would really be interested in just like a show of hands. Have people in this room experienced being called enemies of the people or fake news? Or
not recently, but
but we've been confronted by neighbors, friends, church members who are saying, you guys brought this on yourself, and that's the problem.
But let me tell you. You say that because, like I said, I was there. I was with Brother Malcolm during the last 15 months of his life. That's why I got my introduction to journalism, and I saw how they treated him. And I used to go to rallies and hear him speak, and then read the New York Times the next day, and wonder if myself and the reporter were at the same rally, because we're always about him advocating violence, and he advocated self-defense, but none of them ever said that. And he advocated self-defense. And so that kind of thing going, and nowadays, all of a sudden, they're calling these white supremacists white nationalists.
An interesting side note that I want to bring up on this, when it comes to who's to blame for his rise in the polls and eventual win in 2016, collectively, I guess, the media has recognized that we missed the boat on the underlying currents that were happening in certain parts of the country, people who felt alienated or people who felt threatened by immigrants and so forth. And so what happened after that is that all of a sudden you see all this media descending on rural towns and interviewing people in the local bar or like in rural Wisconsin and kind of like take the pulse of those communities that we collectively in the media had neglected. Well, let me give you an interesting story. Recently, the Washington Post did this big story on how white people feel. I forgot the name of the headline of the article. The intention.
The white minority.
Yes. So the intention of the article was to point out why is it that a lot of people agree with him and he's able to tap into their xenophobia and all of that. The result, though, is the way the article was written came across as being apologetic for those who quote-unquote white nationalists or people who feel that they ought to have the right to express pride in their white culture. And so hear me out on this because the National Association of Hispanic Journalists made a big stink about it. You read the article, where were the minority voices in that article? They were non-existent. It was all focused on poor little white folks who feel threatened by the demographic changes in the U.S. So, I'm just throwing that back at you because I'm trying to figure out what would be the magic formula for journalists to do their job well, while also understanding what's going on in the U.S. and why is it that, according to some people, he may get reelected because we in the media keep underestimating his potential and his power to tap into those very ugly feelings that have always been here in the U.S. Racism had been dormant, I guess, but now it feels emboldened. No, because well, listen. At the rally the other day, the protests in D.C. with the white nationalists. Well, now they're called white nationalists. What struck me? No, but what struck me? Where we are as a country, the environment that we're in, it struck me that they weren't wearing hoods. And someone said to me, well, the reason they're not wearing hoods anymore is that they are permeating the institutions. And they feel emboldened to be in your face about how they feel about their white pride and how minorities are screwing it up for them in this country. So I'm still digesting all the stuff I heard from people about why is it that these people, the handful that came up, some 40 people, they feel like they're emboldened and they no longer have to hide behind a white hood. So that to me was kind of like a really shocking, and I'm still digesting what I saw, because that's where we are in this country, that people no longer feel, political correctness, for instance. It's not even about political correctness, it's about civility, but they have conflated the two, so to the point where they don't care that they're hurting your feelings or that they're saying inaccurate things about your community. And so my question is, where are we as journalists in covering all of those issues that are happening right before our very eyes?
I think we've sort of gone full circle. You can't cover what's going on in these communities if you don't have anybody in the newsroom who's from the community. To me, these things go precisely hand in hand. I just don't see how you can do it if you don't diversify the newsroom.
I think it's also just choices about newsroom coverage. Because I worked in the New York Times Washington bureau, I think like 2003, 4, 5, somewhere around there. And we had a policy of, there were protests all the time on the mall. We had a policy, if it was under, I don't remember if it was 500,000 or 1 million, like we wouldn't cover it. There's so many protests. Why was there so much coverage for 2 dozen people, 1 dozen people, right? So I think, a lot of newsrooms kind of have policies that they're also, they didn't cover I think it was the 100 Moms March or something, and a lot of the, minority communities who are trying to get that public attention, and yet, there are these standards that.
Although I have to say, come on now. There's a bunch of white nationalists show up in Washington, D.C., and you don't expect people to cover that? That's crazy.
That's not the thing. I'm just pointing out something.
A black majority city, by the way.
You still calling them white nationalists?
I'm not saying that the white supremacists were not newsworthy. All I'm just saying is just pointing out a discrepancy that, during my time in the Washington bureau, there were many issue marches, many communities that wanted that type of coverage and couldn't even get, a mention in the smallest font. So that's.
I do think that there needs to be a discussion about that. There were 300 reporters for 40 of these guys.
And it was basically plans that kind of coverage. But it was basically I don't know. The last time the white nationalists showed up, someone died. Right. Of course we're going to show up. We can't see into the future that only 45 of them are going to show up.
So what did you make of the NPR interview where they let the guy sort of spout off?
Well, I don't work at NPR.
I think it was a mistake. I think it was a mistake. I think it was okay if they have him on and want to talk about what's going on Sunday, but to give him a platform and let him sort of give his theory. I'm not arguing with you. I think this is something that journalists need to grapple with.
And the point that you make about people in the newsroom making decisions is right on point, because the New York Times completely missed the candidacy of the young woman who defeated Joe Crowley, and then all of a sudden they're like doing 500 stories about her when they never did anything about her. So the particular standards, quote unquote, in the newsroom happen when you have people that are not part of the community or have no connection to the community, and so they're going to just cover their friends or people that they know, or bring in people to analyze the news among their little fraternity or sorority of friends when you don't have the diversity in the newsroom. to have somebody make these, not just one person, several people making these kinds of decisions of what it is that you're going to be covering, and so that the community doesn't feel neglected or only covered when it's one particular issue.
Okay, Juliet, I'd like to say something.
Yeah, I don't think it's just about diversity and inclusion. It's also about the environment and policies of your news.
Yes.
You can have that. And NPR came out and was like, this is what we did to cover, the white supremacists who we let have that platform. We had X amount of black people who were on that story. They were like, hey, they said it was cool too. And they used the race card to defend themselves about how they gave the platform. It's not just about diversity and who's where. It's about the culture that you developed. It's about the policies that you put in place. And until you have a person high enough to change those, you're always going to have this conversation that's going to wrap around this
Which speaks to another issue that I think we confront as journalists today, and that's the false equivalencies we sometimes create out of a need or a fear or a belief or whatever that we have to cover both sides of the issue. And take climate change, for example. 98, 97, 99% of scientists believe that climate change is real, but when we report on it, we have to give the climate change deniers equal time in our story.
No, that's not universal.
It's not universal, but it exists, and it speaks to a larger question, not the larger question, which is, what are we to do? We only know what we know in the moment. We only know the facts that we learn in the moment. And to the lady's point earlier, after the Iraq War, there was a lot of journalism navel-gazing, which I think was healthy. Navel-gazing is often used as a pejorative term or a negative term, but I think it was extremely healthy, and it led to a lot of additional scrutiny being placed on claims from the government and other sources in the course of reporting a wide variety of stories until most of the media totally missed the Trump effect, as you noted. Eugene Robinson, the columnist for the Post here in Washington, he was on MSNBC on election night in 2016, and when the numbers started to go in Trump's favor, and someone questioned what all the polls said, and Eugene, I will never forget this moment. Eugene Robinson said, "I guess we forgot to go out and count the yard signs." And never were truer words ever spoken. Because I've been traveling through mid-America, I'd seen all the Trump signs, but I live in New York freaking City. The media capital of the world.
But by the way, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote.
And I'm surprised no one has brought this up yet. As far as Trump getting popular all of a sudden, that was our fault too, because never in 20-something years that I've been watching politics have I seen any television network allow a candidate to phone it in. If they ran for president, if anybody ran for president prior to 2016, okay, you're to be at this building at such and such a time, and such a reporter will speak to you. You have to be on camera. But all of them, well, with the exception of CBS, except the one time that Scalia died. But for the most part, CBS was the only network that did not let Trump phone into the control room. ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN, they all let him phone it in. And that really allowed him to build up his...
Well, he got a lot of free coverage.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Richard, I just wanted to add, it's a bit going back to this comment of calling him a lie. He lies so often, every day, most moments in the day, that you spend your whole newscast calling him a liar, or you said in your paper how he lied in so many situations, that the word now loses its impact. It's, he lied, okay, what's new? He lied. So it doesn't have that same impact, and because he's shameless, the fact that he lied doesn't kick him back. This is a man who doesn't read, and who doesn't, so you're not expecting him to say I'm not being ugly. You're not expecting him to say anything intelligent because he doesn't invest in what is required to say something intelligent. So he's always lying. And so then every single report becomes, he lied, what's new, Trump lied, and this is how you have the repeat that may occur. I think also from the journalistic standpoint then, what the example at least that comes to my mind, I just remember the days of Sam Donaldson so well, yelling from the Rose Garden, Mr. President, tell the American people, the challenge, the make you explain it on the spot, or walk away. We're not. That's the push that he doesn't do too many press conferences with the press. When he does, he becomes combative. But it's really the.
But we are shouting the questions. We are shouting the questions, and he just brushes them off.
Yeah, as Reagan did at times too. But it was so many and so poignant that it was clear. Not so much that Reagan was vacuous, but he absolutely wasn't going to answer. In Trump's case, you're talking about somebody who's vacuous. So I don't know that we gain anything from calling him a liar, because he's always lying. He doesn't invest in anything.
Well, what I would suggest that we do is perhaps not put a noun to it or just call him out a liar. I mean, I know that what we do in our newspaper, or what I try to do in my stories, I won't use adjectives in my story. I'll say, well, the White House said this, but according to X, Y, and Z, these are the facts. So I'm not necessarily calling him a liar, but people will read that the facts are different from what the White House is feeding us every day. So I don't know that you necessarily have to call him out every single time, because my goodness, I mean, you run out of ink and newsprint. But I think to keep hammering away, just like they are pushing back on criticizing the way they're covered, I think it's upon us to continue to give the facts. I mean, look at I hate to be such an extremist in this, but look at the Nazi playbook. You repeat a lie enough times until people start believing it, and what do they do next? They start dehumanizing the Jews, and then you have the Holocaust.
That's his playbook right now.
No, but what I'm saying is, so what do we do? What do we do as journalists? We have to keep doing what we do, which is to state the facts. My only concern, when I mentioned this earlier, is that does that really matter when you have a part of the country that refuses to look at the facts and will believe him blindly, because he said it himself. I could shoot somebody and they'll still follow me. And here we are. Well, he said that too, but he also said I can shoot somebody today and they'll vote for me, and here we are. So I don't know what we're doing wrong that the facts are just not getting out there where they need to get.
I think you're asking the question about what do we do as journalists. I want to step back to what Kyle mentioned earlier, which is, so take a look at the impact of all these regulatory changes. How does that affect Flint? What about infrastructure? What happened to that whole program? We have bridges collapsing in Italy. We're going to have them collapsing here again. We've already had that. What about all these changes in education policy? I mean, take those issues and take them out to real people and write about it.
I mean, I think this is one of the pitfalls you fall into with Trump, and we saw it during the campaign, which is he's such a he's such an outsized personality that he just sucks up all the coverage, and there's so much attention being focused on the latest thing that he said. I think that you would put your finger on the biggest challenge for journalists right now. I think, because when we all wake up in the morning and we think, I do this all the time, like, I cannot believe what has just happened. Like, I can't, going back and forth with what happened with the press secretary, that doesn't even capture it. It doesn't even capture the moment that we're living in, which is extraordinary, right? This chapter is crazy. And I think that there has been a failure of journalistic imagination to capture this. I think when you read the daily newspapers and watch daily TV, it doesn't really, sometimes I feel like they're not reporting on the world that I'm living in. And I know that I'm not alone. So I think one of the things that I've talked about is is there is there a more imaginative approach to storytelling that we need to be looking at? Is there a different way, a different kind of voice that we need to be thinking of using? I just think that this, like, the president said this, he's wrong, the press secretary says we're wrong, the Republican congressman says he's wrong, the Democratic congressman says she's wrong. It's not working. It's not working.
I think
it will be piss off today.
I mean, I think there's also an issue, which is this focus on the national level, which is, so I did my doctoral research in Egypt and wrote a book about cyber activism and citizen journalism, what an impact that had there, because it was the only time they weren't in Egypt getting national level news and like connecting that to the people, and that had a major impact, as we saw in 2011. And I think that we can do more of that, because what we heard when we did the first ever press freedom mission to the United States with the global press freedom groups, we went to Missouri and we heard how this rhetoric is trickling down to the local officials. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear more about that. How, for example, the Missouri governor was no longer doing press conferences, but was doing online, social media chats. But that's fundamentally different than opening yourself up to questions from experts who are in depth, following the issues versus, a public, and you're going to choose what the questions are. And I think that we should, get at these national issues and, what we're talking about being unprecedented, and understand how is that translating into the local level, because we're hearing, from the reporters on the ground that they're seeing this trickle down, and I think that can help maybe connect it more to people's real lives.
Right. Well, that would require people getting away from the outrage du jour and the latest stupid tweet, and actually doing issue-related and policy coverage that most, certainly on the TV side, people don't want to go there, because it's easier to put up the tweet and to deconstruct the tweet than it is to take the policy and look at that and look at how that affects a local community.
Plus, it takes longer to do the actual package.
Let Pearl say something.
Oh, yeah, I can try.
Right.
Yeah, I just have a basic kind of question here. As a person who used to be a regular journalist, editor, and reporter, and now I'm more of an activist, because all I want to say is, it seems that you're trying to approach a very unusual and different administration and everything that it brings with it, with old tenets of journalism, and it does not work. I think you have to reinvent journalistic practices in order to deal with what we have going on here now. The old approach to journalism, print, broadcast, whatever, does not work with this administration and everything that's trickling down from it. Because, it's not the only thing. Changes are going on as a result of the tone and the tenor of the administration. So everything is changing, and I just think that journalism has to change, and you can't use those old tactics and old practices to deal with this.
What change how, though?
Which speaks to Kyle's point.
Okay, first of all, I think, you were just talking about climate change. 98% of the scientists agree about climate change. Okay, but you have to cover it as if it's a controversy. Like, that, as if it's 50-50. It's not 50-50. So why do you have to have that kind of balance?
That was my point. I was asking the same question.
Right. So it should be a fact.
I agree.
Yeah. So, I think that we're looking at a lot of things as if they're 50-50, or this side says this, or you have to cover 40 Nazis the way you would cover when we had, 50,000 people out there. That makes no sense. So that's all I'm just...
But besides that, your example about the climate change, for example, I think the way to counteract in this administration is to tell the impact of that. So, for example, you say, cover it as a given that climate change is happening. The Trump administration is saying it's not happening, and therefore you have these particular problems that are going to revert us back to when our children were dying of smog inhalation in New York, for example. Then people make the connection. That's what people do. And we need to think about it more as activists, as investigative journalists, and as movement journalists. And what's happening now in this country, actually, I just came back from a conference in Detroit, a Media Alliance conference, where all these people, the 3,000 people who were there, use media for their different issues that they deal with. But within there was a track of movement journalism, specifically to try to figure out how to counteract the fake news that people are believing and that's dividing the country. Those people believe that those people are journalists. They're journalists with a point of view, and they're journalists who are investigative journalists. They search for truth. They uncover the truth and they develop stories in that way. But they're not looking. Of course, they're not dealing with false equivalency. The whole objectivity thing is out the window. That's a myth anyway. You need to be fair, but not objective. And that's the point of view to look at. So when Lynn was saying earlier about somebody was saying about we're using the old ways of thinking about journalism, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about young people who are thinking about 50-50, false equivalency. No, those young journalists are thinking about this is an injustice. We have to figure out what's going on, we move in that direction, and forget about, if the other thing is...
Then you get into the issue of defining fairness, right? Take for example... But
that's why you have facts and we have facts.
But take for instance the example of immigration. It's such a loaded issue, and I've been covering it for close to 30 years. For instance, the very term illegal aliens. Some of us in the media, in Hispanic media, do not use illegal aliens unless we're quoting somebody, because no human being is illegal. That's my position. But then you get into when you interview sources, and they'll tell you, for instance, a talking point is the law is the law. You're crossing illegally, you're breaking the law, and you get what you deserve. There was a case of a military spouse that was recently deported, right? She had crossed over illegally many years ago, no criminal record whatsoever, but then you had all these other people saying, well, she broke the law, she got it coming, she needs to go. So how do you address, how do you cover those issues where you have different groups not even meeting or even trying to get a middle ground? Can we, for instance, stop saying that people who are demanding a humane solution to the problem of illegal immigration are not necessarily for open borders, okay? For instance, so you have to define the terms also, and you can get into some really murky water there too.
But that's a matter of how you define the terms. I mean, I remember back 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, NHJ had a campaign to get people to stop using illegal aliens, right? We got the media to stop, for the most part, to stop using the term. This is why you use the term. Blah, blah, blah. These days, that's not enough because the administration is using the term. Right. So these days, you have to have more of a context of what you're talking about. It's like the issue of why are these people here? Why is this dehumanizing them in what way? The law is the law, but this is what this means. Why are they here? Have they been here 25 years? It has to do with employment. That's a whole bunch of stuff. So to address that, you just need more of a context in the coverage of immigration. It's not just about a term anymore, because it's more than that in this administration.
Can I just pick up on and in that context, nobody described Chris Collins Congressman Chris Collins. No one described him as the illegal congressman.
Can I just, on what you said about movement journalism and being an activist, I couldn't agree more with you.
Well, there's a difference, though.
There is, but I also feel that there is a sea shift where journalists are realizing, there is a point of view, and that also journalists have to be fighting for press freedom because it's not just a given anymore. So at the Committee to Protect Journalists, almost all of us who work there are journalists. We consider ourselves journalists. We basically have a news wire, daily alerts on what is happening to journalists around the world. That's our beat. But we have a point of view. We believe it is wrong to kill a journalist for doing their job. We believe that journalists should not be imprisoned for their work, but that doesn't, we employ journalistic standards, double sourcing, getting the other side, talking to the officials, etc. But, we certainly are doing journalism with a purpose, and I think hearing more about journalists who do that would be great, and I'd love to hear more about that group that you mentioned.
And that goes back to the question of race, because so many of us for 30, 40, 30 years that I was a journalist were shied away from that, specifically because what we bring to the table was not valued or considered to be activist view. That I couldn't be objective, supposedly, because I'm a black Puerto Rican, covering Puerto Rican community, black community, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, part of, I think, some of the pitfalls that we've seen with that, I think, contributes to the lack of trust that the community has with the press. So, for example, Latino organizations, for example, national organizations, they fought for a long time for fair housing, for fair employment, whatever. Then they decided that the media was a big part of the problem. Because how the media treats you is the amount of respect and power that you're going to have in the government. Therefore, if people see that connection, then they pay attention to the media more. So within Latino communities, for sometimes that has happened. And for example, in Puerto Rican community, I don't know, but in Puerto Rico, for example, the media is seen, for the most part, as a defender of the people. So therefore, you don't have that gap, right? You don't have that. I mean, you have other trust issues because each media has different ideologies, whatever. But you don't have the issue of they're not with the people, or they're some kind of elite over there that doesn't really understand me. And I think we've got to that point in this country where we have to change the way people think about us. And getting to that point, they also need to change the way people think about media's attitudes about race.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that the Kerner Commission wrote about 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the critical link between the coverage and how people in the community see the press. And they made it was a big part of the report. And here we are 50 years later and still basically having the same discussion.
Well, how can we change that? Well, you said part of it has to do with representation, all that, but also it has to do with coverage of communities. And there's without people there to cover it.
Mm-hmm. As you just cut back and all that. Okay, then we want to wrap up after this.
So I wonder about your conversations with senior executives of media companies when we've had this constriction of jobs and layoffs from local newspapers, some shutting down. Yes, we're moving to the digital, but we talked about boots on the streets. There aren't as many boots on the streets as there used to be, and that has to be part of the conversation as well, because who's covering the local stories? When the cuts occur, they seem to be permanent. Most of a lot of black journalists, my friends, have been laid off, pushed out. They're not there any longer. There's not as many journalists on the ground doing the local stuff that you're talking about, reporting on and getting that impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the local news resources, primarily print, have just been decimated, and I think that people have underappreciated how that has contributed to the lack of trust generally in media. Just for the very reason that he was talking about, when people like their local reporter, but they don't like the big media companies. And when those people go away, the only connection they have with media is what's on CNN or what's in the New York Times, and of course they don't trust it because it's distant from them. And then there's all these other issues which everyone here has rightly pointed out about these outlets weren't listening to them, they weren't representing them, they weren't writing about what was important to them. So I think this is a sort of perfect storm of the wipeout of local news, the arrival of Trump, who didn't create these trust issues. He just tapped into them. They were there. And incredible business model challenges for the people who are there. Like, how are they going to just keep the lights on? It's all come together at the same time.
Okay. And I just want to conclude with a shocking fact and a note of optimism.
Optimism.
The shocking fact is that RTDNA research, a different aspect of the research that I shared with you earlier about diversity in the newsroom. We also research annually on staffing in newsrooms. In 2017, for the first time in the history we've been conducting this research, there were more people employed in local broadcast newsrooms in America than local newspaper newsrooms. First time ever. That's the shocking, sobering fact. The optimistic fact I will share with you is that a lot of these, I do talk to these big media company folks in the broadcast business, and they are investing millions and millions and millions of dollars in beefing up investigative reporting units in their companies all over the country, and investing in other areas, digital and other platforms on which to deliver the news, not strictly out of a sense of public service, but out of a need to survive as news consumption habits change. But to me, the most optimistic thing that's going on today is that, call it an effect of whatever this is we're experiencing now is, or for whatever reason, a lot of journalism schools are seeing significant upticks in enrollment. And that gives me hope, and that gives me optimism, and that gives me that makes me believe that despite all the economic challenges, despite all of the fake news BS, despite all of the other issues we've talked about tonight, that there will be a new generation of us out there in a few years who really want to serve their communities and serve their country.
Okay, other concluding remarks?
Well, I wanted to, follow up on that, and I second what you're saying. I think one way, looking forward, that we can encourage more and more people, especially minorities, to join the profession is to also serve as mentors. I mean, I take advantage of every opportunity I get to talk to aspiring journalists because they are also having this discussion. Do I really want to get into this? Do I know what I'm getting into, and is it worth it? And so I think it's important for us to keep doing what we're doing and to also encourage further, future generations to also ask the very same questions that we're asking now, and to encourage them to pursue the truth always.
Yeah, just our reporting shows that it's the local reporters in their communities who face, the gravest threats and are on the front lines. And, I think that we're seeing the same thing here. We've, reported on the particular dangers that minority journalists face during protests. We want to understand how much, the rhetorical focus that we've been kind of talking about in Washington, how much is that impacting reporters on the ground. So, I would encourage you to connect with us, because I think one way to, our role is to highlight the stories of journalists so that you guys can focus on bringing the news. And I hope that you'll, connect with us. And I also want to say, we're really interested in diversifying and making sure we have a diverse workforce as well. And we try to send our job ads to all of the National Association of Journalists for various different groups, and so we have several positions open. And I know it's a certain type of journalism, but it's the best journalism job I've ever had. So I think also encouraging, these young kids who are interested in connecting with their communities to think about the many ways that you can do journalism in today's society, whether it's kind of professional, mainstream approach, or citizen journalism, or anything in between.
Let me give a 90-second plug to this initiative that David Plazas told me about at the Tennessee. And Gannett owns newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville. So the three Gannett papers together are the Tennessee network. and they have just launched a website different from the newspapers. This website, launched in January, is called Civility Tennessee, and it is devoted to civil discourse about this, you know, like a dozen or 2 dozen pictures that you can click on. Some of it looks kind of like good news type things, but some of it is just serious discussion about how about can we discuss climate change civilly, fair and balanced. That he doesn't use fair and balanced, but you know, and David told me that he knows of no similar initiative, but he's interested in promoting the idea at other Gannett newspapers. And so, Civility Tennessee, if you have 2 minutes someday to look at it at the website, you might get an idea of what at least 3 Gannett newspapers in Tennessee are trying to do to promote civil discourse and, in some sense, to refute the notion of we're the enemy of the people.
Just to reiterate what you said earlier, one of my hats is also to teach journalism students at Columbia, and there is a renewed sense of mission and purpose for students coming in. And what's really interesting to me is that we're seeing a number of people who have left the profession, who are now deciding I gotta go back to journalism, and they're coming back as slightly older students, which is really encouraging. But I say that as an encouraging note, but I think we're in for a really rough couple of years here. I think you're starting to see it already in the midterms, and I think the presidential election is going to be brutal in terms of the press's role in it and how it's received. And again, all of this is happening. I mean, there's great numbers on jobs on the TV side, but the consolidation of companies that own all these stations is unprecedented. So it's tough, and you know, I spend a lot of time where there's a lot of people talking about like what is the solution for local news and what are the business models that are going to solve everything, and I'm here to tell you there's no single answer.
Okay. Let's do a panel.
Thank
you all very much. You can talk to them if you have any questions. All right. Thank you. Anybody who has any
Hi guys, so this is Janice, and I want to thank you guys for joining. Please heart, please share. If you're watching the replay, please follow this. Somebody asked, oh, you're welcome. Let's just stop with this fake news stuff. So somebody asked the question, if I'm a journalist, I am curator for the Own Voices channel. I started as a travel writer, and I also had a radio show at one point. So I got introduced to the Journal-isms Roundtable by Mike Oddie of M Tends to Travel. So I just wanted to answer your question, and thanks for joining. And I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. And this is a monthly event. I will try to do the one next month as well. So you're welcome. You're welcome. Ciao, guys. Thank you so much. Oh, and the reason why I blocked so many people is because I don't want people to take over the broadcast, you know, like trolls do. So that's why I do what I do. So, ciao. I'll see you guys later. Well, the Journal-isms Roundtable is an group of African American journalists, but they do have other people who are members as well. So, see you guys later. I hope I answered your questions. So let me turn this around, and see you guys later.